It is just much more plausible to be able to say to somebody in a bar, down the pub, in a cafe, yeah, I am going to church this Sunday and I'm going to take my kids with me. And people are like, oh, yeah, I've been meaning to do that. That is now...
Wow. And you had a conversation like that with Bart Ehrman, who seldom concedes much of anything when speaking to Christians, but he did concede that
everybody wants to save the world, nobody wants to do the washing up. And, you know, the Bible's constantly saying, like Jordan Peterson says, you know, put your own house in order, like tidy your room, right?
Ruslan.
Ladies and gentlemen, I got one of my favorite apologists, and he's not even all the way an apologist. He's really an evangelist, and he's here with us in the studio, originally from Australia, but currently out of UK, Great Britain, England.
Yeah.
You guys have so many words for the
Sussex.
same thing. Yeah, Sussex. Out here in San Diego. Thank you so much for being here, man.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Glenn Scrivener.
Hey.
The one and only. Okay. Could you pull the mic up just a little bit closer so you're nice and loud, nice and present? Okay, so I got hip to you because our mutual friend Wes mentioned you in a couple of interviews he's done. And so I said, okay, who's this Glenn Scrivener? And all of a sudden you started getting worked up my algorithm. The book. Amazing, the air we breathe, how we all came to believe in freedom, kindness, progress, and equality. Amazing book. You describe it as...
It's Dominion for Dummies, and I'm the dummy. So, yeah. So Tom Holland, the historian, wrote the big fat book about the Christianization of the West called Dominion. And he was coming at it from a very secular point of view, just as a historian, looking at the West as the product of centuries of Christianization. And it is the waters that we're swimming in. It is the air that we breathe. And so he kind of wrote that book. And in the process of writing that book, he certainly wrote himself into church. So he started to think about these things, and it led him to all sorts of Christian conclusions. But he's not, you know, out and out as a Christian, but I was wanting to write the same kind of thesis, but from a Christian point of view, and a lot shorter, you know, 200 pages as opposed to 650. So
I'm sure a lot of people appreciate that it's a lot shorter.
I think they probably do. I mean, Dominion sits on a lot of people's bookshelves. It looks fantastic on a bookshelf. And in fact, I gave.
But this is Gen Z, Gen Alpha, baby. Award-winning cover.
Award-winning cover. I had nothing to do with it, which is why I can say award-winning. But look at that, the air blows through it, and I kind of wrote it for my father-in-law because he's the kind of guy who loves reading historical books and historical novels, and he had Tom Holland on his shelf the entire time, and he was not going to take it down and read it. So I thought I'll write him a book.
He wasn't going to take it down, or he's just for aesthetics.
It's just for aesthetics. I mean, that's what physical books are these days. Let's be honest, Ruslan. This is what it is.
That's amazing. Okay, so you write it because you want to have a shorter version for your father-in-law. But you make the same or similar claims as Tom Holland, as a lot of people have been making, Jordan Peterson, as Justin Briley, that Christianity overall has been a massive net positive in the world.
Oh, completely. Yeah.
And your argument in the book is that freedom, kindness, progress, and equality all come from that. And then more specifically, you have a kind of a chapter on all of these. Okay, so equality, compassion, consent, enlightenment, science, freedom, progress. All Christian ideas.
In the ways that we have come to understand these ideas in the West in the year 2025, they are. This is the air that we breathe, such that, so I talk about equality, compassion, consent, enlightenment, science, freedom, and progress. You know that these are transcendent ideals in our world because when anyone reverses any of these, you think that they're a blasphemer. You want to excommunicate them. This is absolutely heretical to disbelieve in equality. Like, we're meant to be equal, no matter male, female, gay, straight, black, or white, we're all equal. Don't you think that? If you don't think that, you get kicked off YouTube pretty quickly, right?
But the world hasn't always been like that. That's the punchline.
Well, exactly. And
pre-Jesus,
man,
what was the world like?
You've got this vertiginously steep hierarchy of being in which, the gods are at the top and then the emperor and the slaves are at the bottom. And, Plato would talk about there are some people who are gold, some people who are silver, some people who are bronze.
Sounds like a caste system of sorts.
It is a caste system, absolutely. And whereas we think that the caste system is the weird thing, actually human equality is the weird thing. Like, we tend to look at cultures that disbelieve in equality as the backwards ones.
Yeah.
And yet really around the world and down through history, the peculiar view is to think that, you take two people and you declare them to be equal, like a Plato or an Aristotle would say, like, well, this guy is richer than that guy, right? And this guy's a man, this guy's a woman, and this is a master and this is a slave, this is a citizen, this is a barbarian. In what sense are they equal? Like, equal how? This person's rich, this person's poor, this person's one class, this person's another class. In what sense are any of these people equal? And what's fascinating is you talk to secular people about this and they recognize, oh yeah, I have beliefs. I didn't think I had beliefs. I thought I was a purely, atheistic, agnostic, secular person who's navigating the world according to reason and evidence. And you just press into any one of these values and you can start to show secular people that actually they're believers, and the sorts of beliefs that they have are profoundly Christian beliefs that they believe in, and they might not be aware that they believe in these things for Christian reasons, but it has been centuries and centuries of Christianization, meditating on the cross, meditating on Christ, meditating on Scripture, that has gotten us to where we've gotten to nowadays. And so I pull on that thread, or I pull on the thread about compassion, So compassion is this belief that a society should be judged by the way it treats its weakest members. And we just and we all go, yeah, sure. That's how everybody thinks. No, that's not how everybody thinks. You've mentioned the caste system. What about karma? Karma is, well, what goes around comes around. And if you put good out into the world, good should come back to you. Where do we get the idea that if someone is down on their luck, someone is an outsider, the last, the least, and the lost, that you should expend your social capital and your money and your energies in order to lift up the lowly? That's not obvious. That's not the way nature operates.
Right.
So why do we think this is natural or obvious or universal to act like this? Well, there's a one-word answer. It's Christianity.
Yeah, that's good. Equality is so taken for granted, and it is such a non-negotiable for society today.
You're a monster if you deny it.
Yeah, you're a monster if you deny it. But it's not. It hasn't always been around. That there was a time, to your point, that people weren't always equal, and now this is all anchored on the Christian worldview. Obviously, also the Jewish paradigm of you're created in the image of God.
Right.
And Jesus says, do unto others as you have them do unto you. Love your neighbor as yourself. That's where the idea of equality from. And those are the verses. I went down the rabbit hole of the abolitionists and the theology of the abolitionists. And there was a lot of, I thought it was going to be all the verses about, the book of Exodus and those. But it was really the verses of, we're created in the image of God.
Yeah, really.
Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself. Do unto others. And that was the framework that led to slavery being destroyed in America. In the West.
I think David Bryan Davis is probably the preeminent historian of the transatlantic slave trade, and his magnum opus is called In the Image of God. And he notes that the abolitionist movement was completely a Bible-centered movement of preachers, evangelicals and Quakers in particular, who are in particular taking seriously the image of God. And that's got a real pedigree to it. You can trace it all the way back to Gregory of Nyssa, in the 4th century.
Right. In his commentary, talking about how slavery is wrong.
Yeah, so he's got this sermon on Ecclesiastes, and he starts it's the first classical objection to slavery wholesale. Different people would object to being slaves themselves. But no one thought to kind of take down the institution. It was so woven into the fabric of society that what would we do without slavery? And so Gregory of Nyssa was meditating on the image of God. And in his sermon on Ecclesiastes, he says, what will you buy and sell the person who is valued as the image of God? So you're like, what price will you put on his head? And that one doctrine of the image of God, you can trace it through. You can see how it's at the heart of the abolition of the slave trade. You can see how it's at the heart of charity. We think that charity is just obvious, that obviously we should expend our own resources to lift up the lowly. And yet, ancient cultures had almsgiving and that kind of thing, but it was usually the rich benefactor who wanted to have a name for himself as somebody who was beneficent and throwing the bridge from the carriage for all the hoi polloi to kind of eat. But the idea that you would serve the poor for their sake and not for your sake was this profound kind of, and again, it was all based on the image of God. And you see these sermons from the early church, and it's very interesting. to think about going into a temple in the first century, and if you go into a Roman temple or a Greek temple, you're just surrounded by images of gods, and you burn incense to them, you do your religious duty, and then you get back out into the world of commerce and you do your thing. You go to a church, and there are no images of God, right? You meet around a table, you hear scripture, you eat bread and wine, and you hear a sermon in which the preacher says, we don't have images of God because we are images of God. If you want to serve God, don't burn incense to an idol. Go and serve the poor and the least and the last and the lost and the lowly. And the way in which you therefore kind of horizontalize your religious devotion births charity. So instead of it being this vertical thing, you're always doing your bit for the gods. It's like, no, forget that. The image of God is kind of in other people. And as you serve them, charity kind of proliferates and abolition and science comes from the image of God, you know? So like the idea that you can do science is not obvious. Like, why should this 3 pounds of gray matter have any purchase on the mysteries of the cosmos? Except that we're made in the image of God. And all the kind of the founders of the Western scientific tradition from the 16th century onwards, they're meditating deeply on the fact that we are in this privileged position as humans who are made in God's image, so we can to some degree know the thoughts of God, and we're commanded to go out into the world and take dominion over it. And it was those people, it was Christians at Christian universities for these Christian presuppositions that birthed the modern scientific movement. And the image of God was at the heart of that as well.
That's beautiful. And I think people will hear these things. Maybe they'll see someone like Tom Holland, who, you know, has been more of an agnostic, maybe perhaps recently coming to faith, and push back. And you had a conversation like that with Bart Ehrman, who seldom concedes much of anything when speaking to Christians. And yet, you guys had a conversation, and he did concede that specific point, that compassion for the least of these, for poor, serving the poor for the sake of serving the poor, because they're created in the image of God, that is a Christian concept. He conceded that. What was that like conversation having that with Bart Ehrman? Because he didn't concede a lot of the other ones, which I don't know how you don't see consent as that. We'll get into that later, or equality, but he did concede that compassion was overflowing from a Christian world. That is what Christians unequivocally, from an agnostic, one of the leading textual critics, conceded that compassion is definitely the downstreams of a Christian worldview.
Yeah, and I think it's hard to deny that this was a revolution in the ancient world, that where the ancient world uses power to dominate, you know, Christ comes and says, you know, Mark chapter 10, verse 45, you know, I did not come to be served, but to serve and to give my life as a ransom for many. This inversion of the way of nature is a profoundly Christian thing. So he acknowledged that, and then we, you know, he didn't like the equality stuff because he thought that Christianity has always stood against equality, and he went into sort of male-female equality. He thought the church has been bad for women, and we got into that kind of stuff. But my challenge back to Bart Ehrman at that point was, he seemed to think that all the progress that we've made in things like equality has only really happened since the Enlightenment, since we kissed Christianity goodbye, and now we've discovered equality in terms of getting rid of the bad dark ages of the church. And I kind of challenged him on that essentially that's a creationist view of history, that there were long ages of darkness, and then, you know, Immanuel Kant said, let there be enlightenment, and there was enlightenment. And out of nothing erupts this modern notion of secular liberal values. And I do think that the Bart Ehrman view of history is this kind of creationist view of history in which there is nothing, and then boom, right? Everything when we kissed Christianity goodbye. I don't find that satisfying or plausible.
No, I would agree with you. Do you think that he was close on any of the other points that you made, or was that the only one that he seemed to push against? Because I think consent is also an easy one, right? Like women's rights and bodily autonomy, and that you can't just have sex slaves just because you're in a position of power. That Christianity definitely seems to have added a lot to monogamy being a virtue. But do you think he was close on that one?
No, he wasn't close on that one. And it's a tough sell with people who have bought the paradigm that the sexual revolution of the 1960s has been this unequaled good for society, and that's the sexual revolution that we really need to pursue, and the church has always been against that sexual revolution. What what I'd like to say to people like that is that the sexual revolution in the 1960s was really the reverse of the first sexual revolution, which happened 1900 years before the swinging 60s. That actually, with the first century church, what you get is the sexual revolution that says men must be as constrained in their sexuality as women had always been expected to be. And there was the equalizing of the sexes. And Jesus just says it's one man, one woman for life. The doors are locked. You don't get out of this thing alive. You know, it's this real constraining of male sexuality, which I think has been for the utter blessing of the world.
Absolutely.
Actually. Now, the 1960s sexual revolution, which we've been taught to think is the really liberating thing, is, you know, instead of men being as constrained as women, it's basically saying through, you know, contraception and through easy access to abortion, you know, women are to be as liberated as men have always been. But that kind of the eruption of libido and letting that, you know, letting that loose on the world, I think has not been for the greater blessing of this world.
Well, I think it's interesting that secular spaces have acknowledged now people would say they were more far right and conservative, like the trad wife movement and the red pill spaces, the manosphere, that the sexual revolution was not a net positive, that it was a con, it was negative, it wasn't helpful. You framed it brilliantly, and you said like men's libido, and you're trying to bring women to be as sexually liberated as men. To me, the hilarious part is like, what does liberated even mean? Right? Like, freedom is not about unrestrained pursuit of your most carnal desires, your most animalistic desires. I'm just gonna conceding that evolution is true, which that's a whole nother conversation. But like, my most animalistic primal desires is just spread my seed everywhere, and women should be that way too. Like, that's crazy to me.
Yeah. And have you ever met people? Like, have you ever met human beings before? Like, men and women are different when it comes to sex and sexuality. And making women play a male-coded game when it comes to sex is not, in the long run, good for women or for men, actually. And the people who really miss out in the sexual revolution are children. Like, always. They pay the price, because in the first century sexual revolution, basically Jesus is tying men to their women and to their offspring. Because biology does not tie a man to his offspring. Biology doesn't tie a man to his woman either. A man can be Genghis Khan, and he can spread his seed as widely as a human being has ever spread his seed. And we don't consider Genghis Khan to be the greatest human. Why not?
Well, why not exactly? But this was just echoed by Andrew Tate on the PBD podcast. So the question is, how much time do you get with your kids? Someone asked him that. Maybe we could slice that in post. And his answer was, well, as a man, there's degrees of potency. And if you are more potent, then you need less time to impact more with your just presence. And so basically he said, I don't need a lot of time with my kids because I'm a more potent man and I'm more interesting, and therefore I don't have to be with my kids. And so he has however many baby mamas and however many kids with those women, and it's okay. But even his own comment section, even the PBD comment section, was roasting that, like, this is utter and complete cope. Like, boys especially need their father. Kids need their father, but especially boys need their father. And to just be like, because I'm potent and I'm a man's man and I'm a high value man, therefore I don't have to be present, is complete ridiculous foolery.
Well, the charges that he's facing would show that this is a kind of a monstrous philosophy, I think. And it's basically saying, be more Genghis, you know? And at the same time as you've got Genghis Khan, you've got, in the Middle Ages in Christendom, you've got this very different vision for what men are meant to be. You've got chivalry, right? And what is a knight of the round table meant to do? Yes, he's meant to be strong. Yes, he's meant to go out into the world and forge a way ahead, but it is in order to save and protect and bless the damsel in distress, you know, and we can have all sorts of arguments about, you know, how diminutive that makes women in that scenario. But in a very unsafe world in the Middle Ages, you probably better have Lancelot looking after you. And in that setting, you've got kind of the opposite of the Genghis Khan view. The Genghis Khan view is that he uses his power in order to dominate, and the chivalrous view is that masculinity is to be used to serve others. There's been a fascinating book written by evolutionary biologist called Joseph Henrich. It's called The Weirdest People in the World, talking about why the West is peculiar and why it's prosperous. And he says it's utterly because of Christianity. You know, he's not a Christian at all. Evolutionary biologist, Harvard University. But he says that basically what the church did through its marriage and family program, which is its sexual ethic, he says it reached down and grabbed men by the testicles. Right?
Come on.
Which is a very raw way of saying it constrained and channeled male sexuality into its proper ends, which is to bless and serve the family. And from that has come all the peculiarity and all the prosperity of the West simply through that sexual revolution. So people who say that the real liberation comes in the 1960s, I beg to differ. I think we need to go 1900 years earlier.
Yeah, well, if you look at the Old Testament, the sign for the children of Israel was circumcision. Right? I don't think that was an accident. I think there was something to, hey, we're going to mark you at your member. And then in the New Testament, we see this idea of the circumcision of the heart, right? You don't have to get circumcised as a man, but there is a circumcision that happens of the heart. And I think perhaps that's alluding to a complete paradigm shift of how we're viewing sexuality versus how God designed it. It's different. You know, people are not always the most ethical when it comes to how they engage, especially with people who they have power over. But you have this harnessing and suppression of it so that there's the most amount of goodness and beauty ushered in through sexuality now.
Yeah, because what happens in nature is that, you know, the Genghis Khans get all the women as, you know, wives and concubines, or you know, look at biblical times, Solomon, you know, 1,000 wives and concubines. This is no good for the wives and concubines. It's also no good for the non-elite males, right? You get a lot of incels if Solomon's got all the women. But there is this redistribution of availability to find a partner when you have the Christian marriage and sex kind of program. And so, I think
I think that's where I've seen arguments made against polygamy because if polygamy is the system, then that means the most powerful men are going to have all the women. And so then you'll have a natural underclass of men that will likely rise up and be upset that they can't have a family and be married.
Right. And every story of polygamy in the Old Testament is a story of strife, right? People sometimes go back to the Old Testament and kind of say, you know, you want biblical marriage? Oh, which biblical marriage? Do you want Solomon? Do you want Abraham with his wives and that kind of thing? But that, I think, fails to understand how narrative works in the Hebrew Bible. And how narrative works is not that the narrator comes in and says, now, Abraham did a bad thing with Hagar here. Instead, it just shows you, you know, the impacts of that kind of way of life. And polygamy does not come out smelling of roses.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Let's talk about your conversation, your debate with Matt Delahanty.
Okay.
I have seen Matt Delahanty do really well in certain debates. I've seen Matt Delahanty rage quit. And I've seen Matt Delahanty, I think, take a pretty big L in your conversation with him when he started. Specifically, I think it really went off the handles for him when he started straw manning Christianity and like, why does God like the smell of blood and all this
God sacrificed himself to himself for a weekend to fix everything for everyone.
Right. And you did this brilliant breakdown and just made it really simple of like, well, one of the roles that the priest had was he's also the butcher. And like the meat wasn't just like burnt and then discarded. They ate the meat, and the animal is literally symbolizing the death of an animal for the life of the people. Like the way you articulated that was so brilliant. And then I think he just, in my opinion, unraveled because he then gets into the thing that completely falls apart, which is like your worldview does not have any sort of virtue ethic. And so the question Justin finally asks him, like, can atheism or whatever you want to call it, secular humanism, present a better alternative? And he's like, I don't know. And they're like, debate lost, bro. Debate lost. How was that debate? What was it like? What was it like doing that in the moment? Did you feel like he failed and he lost, or was it like, oh, this is actually more of a back and forth?
Well, I mean, going into it, I thought I was on a hiding to nothing. I don't know why I said yes, except, you know, I've got some sort of self-harm tendencies, clearly. But I said yes, and I remember the morning of the debate, I was giving a talk in Eastbourne, where I live on the south coast of England, and it was to a women's group they were all retirees, so that they're all grey-haired old grandmas in their 60s and 70s and 80s. And I just said to them at the end, I'm just off to London to debate this atheist, and they said, well, we will pray for you, won't we? And I thought that they meant I would go and catch the train, and they would pray. No. And they all stood together. Aww. And there were like nearly 100 old ladies sort of standing, and this one woman was sort of praying, holding onto the microphone. Yeah. And I was just in the middle of that prayer thinking, you know what? Matt Dillahunty does not have a prayer. Like in very literally, he doesn't have a prayer. And like, I can go into this with a real freedom, and I could go into this because he knew nothing about me. Nobody knows anything about me, so I kind of have that as a blessing to debate others with. And then we got into the debate, and I thought I did okay. I thought I did quite well. But then the debate came out, and all his audience sort of came into the comment section. And
well, because at the time he was pretty high profile. He was higher profile than you were, and so you're gonna get just that cage stage atheist that's just mad at Christianity flooding the comments. I have a massive update for you. I'm sure by this point you've heard about the Blessed God Summit happening March 27th, 28th, 29th here in beautiful Carlsbad, California. But we've heard your requests. We've conceded to your demand. There are virtual tickets that are now available for the Blessed God Summit, so you can access it from anywhere in the world, as well as access to the replays. And for those of you guys that are looking for something extra, we're also offering a virtual ticket and an exclusive Bless God Summit merch bundle. There's some amazing art and some exclusive pieces done by our friend Josh Nadeau from Sword and Pencil that you have to check out. So join us online for the virtual event and experience some sessions from my favorite podcasters, pastors, and performers. We have a stacked lineup. I'm talking about Preston Perry, Dr. Sean McDowell, Inspiring Philosophy. What do you mean? Lila Rose, Alan Parr and his wife Jen Parr. We even have Nate Sala from Wise Disciple, Gavin Ortland, David Wood, Avery from God Logic Apologetics. And on the pastoral side, we have my friend Daniel Golding, Pastor Ed Newton from CBC in San Antonio, and my personal pastor from Rhythm Church, Pastor Jeff Moores and his wife Erin Moores. You won't want to miss out from amazing performances from America's Got Talent winner Dustin Savella, Billboard charting hip-hop artist John Keith, and Miles Minnick. And we're still finalizing a few more speakers. So head over to blessgod.shop, get your virtual ticket now, and you can get yourself a bundle with some of the exclusive merch as well. I'll see you over there, all right? Peace.
So it's very, very interesting. And so you read the comments and, Glenn Scrivener was destroyed and all that kind of thing. Last year I was in Australia giving a series of talks, and on the first night, this guy came. He said he was new to faith, and he said, I almost didn't come when I heard that it was you speaking, because I heard the debate, back in the day when it came out. And I wondered, am I going to waste an evening on the guy that Matt Dillahunty destroyed? And so and he said, I came and I really enjoyed, what you said. I just wanted to encourage you that you've come a long way in the last 4 years. And so, I just let that. So tell me some more about your story. And he, it was a wonderful story about how in the last 12 months he's come to Christ. And then just towards the end of the conversation, I just said, maybe have a look at the debate again and see what you think. And then later in the week, he came back to me. He said, I don't know what I saw. I don't know what I was watching in 2020, but you totally destroyed Matt Dillahunty. And so the same person watching the same debate, I guess he's not the same person, right? In one big sense. And that makes you sort of see debates in a different way, doesn't it? That there is no neutrality.
Yes. There's no neutrality here, and then the scriptures talk about specifically with the Jews, but there's a veil over their eyes, right? And so I think you do filter things through your current paradigm and worldview. And so if your worldview is aligned with Matt Dillahunty's, you're gonna see it from a very specific paradigm that just is, in my opinion, just wasn't accurate.
And I saw that again with Wes Huff, going on with Billy Carson. And never has anyone destroyed. We put in caps lock on YouTube, so and so destroys so and so. We don't really mean it, but when Wes Huff went against Billy Carson, it was like, oh my goodness, call the doctor. This is Ralph Wiggum style. Stop it, he's already dead. And that kind of got me to see that there is something possible with debates where if somebody is all front and no substance, the kind of the exposing of a person can do immense good, because you just read the comment section underneath that debate and you see so many people who said, I don't know why I was following Billy Carson for so long, but now I've seen like the absolute vanity of it all, and I'm coming back to Jesus, or I'm trying church for the first time, and like extraordinary. I don't think I've seen a debate do as much spiritual good as that debate did.
I don't think I've seen a debate do as much spiritual good and also elevate someone's profile like that. And this is what I mean in a very literal sense. I just was at the Apologetics Canada event with Wes. He spoke, I spoke, and then we did a panel together. And then they were like, all right, we're going to give people 10, 15 minutes to come meet you guys. And so we just literally hopped off the stage and we're just in the front meeting people. And he was like a beetle.
Yeah.
He was smart. And I had, a couple people come up and talk to me, and then it was almost like people lining up to talk to him. They just felt like, oh, Ruslan doesn't have anybody. It's like, well, let me get a picture with you, Ruslan.
Yeah.
I had never.
What's Wes like?
I had never seen anything like that. I mean, he was just swarmed with people, and I was like, this is it. And Wes is such a cool guy,
really,
and he does not play into that celebrity thing in the slightest, because I think that's how you combat celebrity and like people who are now like, oh my gosh, you're so and so, is that you just humanize them. Like you start talking about them and you lean into the conversation. And he's such a guy, but it was so wild to see that like in person. So not only are people coming to faith and detangling the foolishness they used to believe in, like this dude's kind of a celebrity, and here's the kicker, and I'm not saying that in a disparaging way or in a way to glorify celebrity, but like if there's anyone I want to be a celebrity, it's a Wes Huff. It's someone like you. It's someone that did the work and doesn't want to be a celebrity, and God just breathes on what they're doing, and their profile lifts like that.
Which is kind of like the anti-Billy Carson kind of model, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like for whom celebrity was everything, and then there was no substance behind it. I think Wes Huff is the opposite of that. I went and did the Apologetics Canada thing in November.
Okay.
So right before it all blew up. So he picked me up from the airport and was like, what's going on in your world? And he said, well, I've just debated this guy called Billy Carson. Have you heard of him? I was like, no. And the tapes are not being revealed. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. I thought nothing of it. And then we just did the conference. And then, the next month he's on Joe Rogan. It's amazing what God is up to in that.
It's really cool. Well, it kind of brings us to what Justin Bradley's been talking about. That's a mutual friend of ours, right? The surprising rebirth and belief in God. Did I say his book right? I think that's it. Yeah. And I think that, Gavin Ortlund has said there's a vibe shift. You're seeing it in your own local church. You've told me about this in terms of you have a couple, maybe a dozen guys showing up, half a dozen guys showing up, and they are there because
just Jordan Peterson and the constellation of social media channels and podcasts around him. And and when I say half a dozen in my church, that's a huge proportion, right? Because I'm
how big is your church?
There's probably 200 coming on a Sunday morning and that sort of thing. But the stories are repeated again and again. It's usually a guy, usually in their 20s. They've just ordered a Bible from Amazon, or they're taking their whole family to church. They're deciding that I've got a neighbor. He's like 4 doors down, and he started taking his church. He started taking his family to church. And I said, why is that? And he said, well, it seems like Christianity has built the West, and I don't know the first thing about it. And I said, oh, so the whole Tom Holland thesis.
Yeah, it's funny because I have a book about this. You should go check it out.
I'll give you a friend price. And there are a number of neighbors who are basically, taking their families to churches.
Wow.
Because of the Tom Holland thesis. And that kind of thing is happening a lot. Some of them are taking them to churches I wish they wouldn't take them to, but I think we are experiencing something of a shift in which the plausibility structures are shifting. And it is just much more plausible to be able to say to somebody in a bar, down the pub, in a cafe, I am going to church this Sunday and I'm going to take my kids with me. And people are like, oh, yeah, I've been meaning to do that. That is now the reaction, as opposed to you're doing what? What's going on with that? And so people are coming and they're wanting something that is deep and rich and old and challenging. and wise and sane and grounded because the culture wars are swirling around. And they're wanting something sacramental and liturgical. I'm part of the Church of England, and so they will come to our kinds of churches because we've got the pointy spire and it looks like a church. But we're quite an evangelical Anglican church, and so they're wanting us to be more liturgical and more sacramental than we ditched all that stuff in order to be missional. And now, actually, the missional thing is you do weekly communion, and you stand for the creed, and you have, your prayers and stand up and sit down and kneel and all that kind of stuff. That's what people are looking for. That's not a barrier anymore. That's a bridge to faith.
Yeah, that aspect, like the I don't want to say the resurgence of high church, but the explosion of high church right now, especially amongst young men, is very fascinating. I know in France they're experiencing big surge with Catholicism exploding. Obviously, Eastern Orthodoxy amongst young men is exploding. That is very, very interesting. So it's almost like people want it to be hard, and not accommodating.
No, exactly. Yeah, and I think the evangelical sensibility is to be we're just sort of bundles of availability.
Yeah.
We're just quivering availability, like us.
Yeah.
And the whole thing is sort of a breadcrumb trail into church. And sometimes I characterize it as sort of evangelical evangelism is often a bit like you've got this incredible cathedral there, and the evangelical evangelist, like I am, usually stands outside with a little pamphlet, like explaining with a thumbnail sketch the diagram of the cathedral and how the cathedral works. And we just want to make everything plain and understood and simple. And I think traditional Christians have forever just been like yanking people and just taking them inside the deep weird of Christianity and showing them something that is cathedral-like in structure, and you won't always get it. And that might not be the point. Maybe the point is to surrender to the mystery, surrender to the story, and be found again, not as somebody who explains everything or understands everything, but somebody who has been overwhelmed by something that is far beyond us.
Well, that's interesting you say that, because then the question becomes like, well, what is the role of apologetics in that? And I'm okay, and this might frustrate some people, like I'm okay with a degree of mystery in my faith. I'm okay with not being 1,000% certain of everything. I'm okay with there being paradoxical tension I have to hold in different aspects. And I think, especially in the West, especially with an evangelical or more fundamentalist evangelical circles, like they need every I dotted and every T crossed, and they need a certainty and a very wooden view of these things, where I'm just like, there's a mystery there and it's beautiful.
Yeah. And how does faith happen? I think faith happens in the community of people in which you surrender yourself to something that is larger than you. I'm often thinking of the road to Emmaus. So Luke chapter 24, how does the risen Jesus encounter this couple? Because this is the big day in which the risen Christ is going to display his glory. And, first of all, he's just kind of incognito walking up alongside them, what's been happening? And they get into this conversation. And then he opens the scriptures to them, which, warms the cockles of my evangelical heart. And I think, oh, fantastic. He leads them in a Bible study. And at that point, they give their lives to Jesus, right? Like, no. He leads them through the Bible study. And then he makes like he's going to go further, and they invite him home, and they basically have a mini church service. And then he breaks the bread. And in the breaking of bread, their eyes are open. And they say, were not our hearts burning while he was on the road speaking of the scriptures to us? And so, yes, it is the scriptures. But yes, it is also this mini church sacramental kind of experience in which Christ is made real to people. And I think that is where people are finding faith. We absolutely need the scriptures to reframe people's perceptions of things. But, Paul Vanderklay, the YouTuber,
He roasted me once for my thumbnail faces, and then we met, and he was like the sweetest guy at the first arc.
Yeah. I think he does all his thumbnails in PowerPoint. I think he basically. Yeah. But he says, like, if you want to believe something, find a group of people who believe it and join them. Which is.
That's what I told Alex O'Connor, though.
Right.
Oddly enough, I said, hey, man, like perhaps your entire view of faith as these propositional truth claims that you have to have 100% certainty of is a different paradigm than what faith truly is, which is a trust and a confidence of something that is uncertain, and then the practice of said trust and confidence. And then in hindsight, you look back and you go, oh, I am more certain and more confident after I walk through the process.
Yeah.
And he was like, well, I just would feel like I'm faking it. And I was like, just pray, dude. Just
Right.
pray and just see what happens. Well, I feel like I would fake. I feel like I would be testing God, and that wouldn't be fair. And I'm like, nah, man. Like many of us attended church or stepped into a service or something of sort without having all of the answers, and just said, oh, I'm gonna give this a little bit of trust and a little bit of faith and see what happens.
It's such a faulty view of faith to see. Faith is being able to tick off every single item of a creed, assenting to this list of truths. Is that what faith is? No, faith is loyalty, trust. Faith is trust in Jesus. Does that mean you know everything about Jesus? It's like, how did I get to know my wife? Did I get to know my wife with a clipboard and a pen and 17 questions, each more tricky than the last? That's not how you get to know everybody. And if that is the way you're getting to know somebody, that's probably why you're still single, right? Like if this is how people are doing it. But what you do is you spend time with them, they spend time with you, you enter into their world, they enter into your world. And at some point you're like, okay, I don't know everything at all, but I'm in. And then you get married, and then all the questions really begin. Questions like, why are you like this? Who raised you? What's going on? What's going on with this? Suddenly you have all these questions. But the questions now really mean something because you jumped in with both feet to the trust thing. And you have those questions on the inside of the faith. And so that's where apologetics comes in. I think apologetics has always been this thing that strengthens the faith of believers. And actually, it's kind of on the inside of the church.
Because it's a defense against the faith, right? Whereas polemics would be like, we're going to argue and fight. Apologetics is saying it's a defensive state once you're already in the church. And let's go back to 1 Peter 3:15, where the word comes from, always be prepared to give an answer, an apologia to anyone who asks you for the reason for the hope that you have. Do this with gentleness and respect. Now, notice who is initiating that conversation. It's not the Christians, not the apologist. It's somebody else who's basically looking at, in 1 Peter, some refugees who are clinging on by their fingernails, loving Jesus, and somehow they're still standing. And basically the non-Christian is saying, how are you still standing after the year that you've just had? And the apologetic is saying, I don't know, but somehow Jesus has got me through. Do you know Jesus? Can I invite you to a community in which you can experience Jesus? That's apologetics in the first century sense. Yeah, that's good.
I think we've twisted and detached it from that over 2,000 years.
Yeah, no, I love that. I love that painting because I think doing life with people is oftentimes the best witness for the faith. I love how you explain that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about. I think your paradigm of the world is interesting because you're in the UK. You guys are probably a bit, I think it's fair to say the word liberal than us in the United States. And I think you end up having these really refreshing and interesting points with regards to our political climate here in America. And there's one video specifically where it was J.D. Vance, and he said something that I was like, oh, this is a no-brainer. He said something along the lines of you take care of your family first, then you take care of your community, then you take care of other communities and other the nations. And that was his tie into an American first approach. And it was this massive divide that was caused. And you took a fairly middle of the ground approach because I'm very much so hey, if you have your house in order, and then you take care of your extended family, then you pour into your local church. That is how we usher in change, right? And then yes, of course, when opportunities present themselves, as in Galatians, we care for refugees, we care for other people, right? But not at the expense of our own household, not at the expense of our own children, right? And you obviously agree with that, but then you also had a bit of a nuanced take on that. Can you kind of expand your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you can find all kinds of verses for that kind of let us look after our neighbor. I mean, I love that the Bible does not say go love the world. God loves the world. You are not called to go and love the world. You are called to love your neighbor, which is a very different thing. It's like everybody wants to save the world. Nobody wants to do the washing up. And, the Bible's constantly saying, like Jordan Peterson says, put your own house in order, like tidy your room, right? And so I love that, you can find all these scriptures about, if a man does not look after his own household, he's worse than an unbeliever, and all that kind of stuff. So you can find a lot of encouragements to love those who are nearest and dearest to you, and in concentric circles to widen that circle. Within the same scriptures, though, you also get these incredible kind of love the stranger and love them as your neighbor, right? So even within Leviticus 19, that's love your neighbor as yourself. it kind of finishes off that chapter by talking about, well, remember, you were aliens in Egypt. And so what I want you to do is, when I say love your neighbor, I don't just mean love people who look like you. I mean, actually, love. And so what's beautiful about there is you've got the union really of love for the outsider, but it's also a love to make them proximate, to love them as yourself. Because the assumption is that you already love yourself a very great deal. You already serve yourself in all sorts of ways, and so you are to go beyond yourself in this way. One of the problems, I think, if you just do an America First thing, is that who's going to challenge you to love those beyond this concentric circle and that concentric circle and that concentric circle? And at some points, you can get into the Luke chapter 10 problem of being like the teacher of the law, who's like, hang on, Jesus, but who is my neighbor? You're like just wanting to constantly shrink the circle and shrink the circle and shrink the circle to make it manageable. And of course, Jesus explodes that with the Good Samaritan. Now, what the Good Samaritan doesn't do, which is what some liberals will say, is the Good Samaritan, you don't outsource it to the state, right? This is personal charity that the Good Samaritan exercises. He doesn't do everything for the guy by the side of the road. He just does enough to put him on his donkey, and he just pays the 2 denarii, puts him in an inn. He'll circle back to him. He doesn't do absolutely everything for the guy, and it's not a love for somebody on the far side of the planet. It's a love for somebody who is your proximate neighbor, who you're passing.
An opportunity presented to you.
Yeah.
And you make the most of that opportunity.
Yeah.
Oh, and by the way, you actually have a denarii to take care of the guy. You actually have the means to take care of the guy.
Yeah,
right?
That's true.
And so it's like, it's not like we're saying, hey, like, I'm going to take care of this guy, but my kids are going to starve.
Yeah.
It's no, this dude has the means, the resources, and the opportunity presented in front of him to care for this person.
Yeah, that is a very good point. Margaret Thatcher, I remember, so I was at the very same Oxford College that Rory Stewart was at. So Rory Stewart is the guy who really took issue with J.D. Vance, and they had a massive Twitter spat about it. So he's the English guy who, even though he was a conservative politician, was more on the liberal side of things compared to J.D. Vance. And we were at the same, Oxford College, and so, politically, certainly I've come from that side of things. But he was kind of wanting to say, let's foreground the Good Samaritan. And I remember back at Oxford, I was writing an essay about politics, and I was deriding Margaret Thatcher, who said famously that the thing we always forget about the Good Samaritan is that he was rich. And you can't be a Good Samaritan unless you're rich. And I remember 20 years ago kind of writing an essay and said, like, this evil witch, what an awful woman to think that. But, that's what happens when you get into your 40s. You're just no.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, I mean, I think the parable of the talents, going right into caring for the least of these, I think that's on purpose. Like, I think people read these 3 separate, first 2 parables, which is about the wise and the foolish virgins. Live as if Jesus is going to return, right? That's the first one. And then it goes into the parable of the talents, which I would argue isn't just about money, but he's using money as an illustration there. But I think it's about our resources in general. And then oddly enough, from there, it goes to caring for the least of these. Now, I'm not one of those people that would say, like, the least of these brothers and sisters are only Christians, because that's been kind of like a hot take on the right. It's like, no, this is just for Christians. This is just for persecuted Christians. No. I think it's and both. I think it's for both Christians and non-Christians. But the parable of the talents is, they have means now, and then they care for the least of these, right? So I think some of the conversation is like, one, do we have the means to care for people?
Yes.
And should there be a framework around 1 Timothy 5, which I think is a beautiful chapter about these widows, and they're not being cared for. And so Paul is like, hey, care for the widow in your own household, basically, right? He does not provide for the needs of his family, his immediate family. And then, like, those widows who are young enough to get remarried, they should get remarried. And then those widows who can't remarry, that's who the church should care for. Yeah. And then at the end, oddly enough, is that, and I just discovered this like this week, that same chapter is where he goes into and a pastor or elder of a church who's good and faithful in teaching the word should be worthy of a double portion. Yeah. Which is, most people would agree, like, that means that a pastor should be paid well and taken care of well, right? So it's interesting that there's this hierarchy laid out in 1 Timothy 5, and then goes into 1 Timothy 6, which is all the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil, right? Yeah. So I love that, like, Paul's like creating this tension and this balance of like, yes, you're home, but your church home as well. And by the guy that preaches to you and cares for your soul, pay him well.
Yeah,
you know,
that's really interesting. And so I think, yeah, a lot of what was going on behind this J.D. Vance debate was often unspoken, and often the unspoken thing, certainly on the more liberal side of things, was that, oh yeah, we're rich, we've got plenty of resources to go around. That was kind of an unspoken, untested assumption going on. Also, secondly, that the state is the proper agent in which to do the work of the Good Samaritan.
Not to chime in too much, but this is where I would say the right gets it wrong because they don't offer up a different solution for who is supposed to care.
Yeah, right.
Who is supposed to provide resource. So I think if the presupposition is the state is supposed to do all of it, well, that's kind of crazy. But if the presupposition is on the right, which I think this would be a better story to tell on the right. Hey, we want to make the government small in your life. We want to make it so you don't get taxed as much so that you can go and care for the least of these. You can go and do the charity. You can go and give to that church, that mission, that nonprofit, whoever, whether you want to do it globally or locally, you can do that. And I think if the right especially in America, did a better job of telling that story, I think some of this will be alleviated. But I think right now it's like they're bad, immigrants bad, refugees bad, bad. We don't have it. We got to take care of America first. Bad. And it's like, well, a better story is, hey, we need to take care of our own. But the way we take care of others is by making it feasible so you can earn more money, so you can give more away.
Yeah. And I think those on the right adopt at rates that are far outstripping those on the left, those who are Christian.
The data's already there. I would agree with you. I just don't think there's a vision being casted for it.
But I think that's kind of a paradigm. I think pretty much our immigration issues should be nested underneath the broader issue of hospitality.
Yes.
How do we do hospitality?
Yes.
So I'm an adoptive dad. So I've got two kids. We were offered a couple of years ago. Would we like to take a third at that stage who has additional needs? That we concluded after a lot of agonizing prayer. We thought that those additional needs were beyond what our family could cope with and what our two existing children could cope with. And so at that stage, we said no to the third child. Now, did we say no to the third child because we were gracious enough for two, but we're not too gracious? I think probably, and I hope this is the case, I think we were gracious enough to have two and gracious enough to say no to the third. Because we wanted to look after the children that we already have.
The two you have are adopted as well?
Well, we've got one natural child, one adopted
Got
child.
it. Okay.
And so you might think that the gracious thing would always be to expand the number of children that you have in the family. No matter what's happening with the 13-year-old who might be going off the rails, et cetera, et cetera. That's not the case in our family, but I think that kind of paradigm people can instantly see in a world of finite resources.
Yes.
That actually loving your neighbor is starting. Charity does begin at home. That the goal is always to expand that circle of love, but that sometimes because of
limitations,
finite resources, you say no. But you're not saying no because I'm kind of loving but not very loving. You're being maximally loving by saying no, by drawing a circle, because I think that hospitality is the context in which it makes sense.
Yeah, ultimately about stewardship, right?
Yeah,
I think there's a paradigm that says, just have as many kids as the Lord would give you, and I would say, man, that's beautiful, and I do believe that can expand your capacity. However, what if you don't have the means to care for all those kids? And what do you do that? And again, that's not a soft push for birth control or anything like that, but that is a real reality that a lot of people have to count the cost on.
Yeah. It's interesting. A couple of years ago, I was preaching on the Good Samaritan, and on the way to church, I was staying with somebody else. He was driving me on the way to church, and we passed underneath this sort of bridge that was going over the street where we were. There was a man in great distress. He had 1 foot on one side of the fence, another foot back on safety, and it looked like he was going to jump. And we kept on driving because I had a sermon to preach, right? So I open my sermon and I tell that story. On the way here, we passed by a guy in great distress, and we passed on by. And you could have heard a pin drop in the congregation. And I said, it might help you to know that there was a police officer there and there was an ambulance crew down there. In a sense, the Good Samaritan had already shown up because we've kind of outsourced the Good Samaritan to a large degree, especially in the UK, to social services and to the state in that kind of way. But what was fascinating to me, kind of circling back to the air we breathe, is everybody in that room. It was a guest service. There were loads of non-Christians in the room. Everybody thought the wrong thing to do was to pass on by. Everyone thought I was a moral monster for about 30 seconds. I allowed them to think that, and I gave them the context.
Very clever.
But then you're able to say, like, do you not see? You're a believer.
Yeah.
You might think you're an agnostic. You don't really hold beliefs. You only go by the evidence and what reason and facts will lead you to. No, you believe in these things so strongly. And let me tell you where this has come from.
That's good.
And then I kind of preached the Good Samaritan. And what I love about the Good Samaritan is fundamentally the Good Samaritan is Jesus, right? Like, here is this guy who has gut-wrenching compassion for the dude by the side of the road. And that word for gut-wrenching compassion, it's a word that's only ever used of Jesus. It's the number one word to be used for his emotional life. It's this kind of gut-wrenching, stomach-churning pity. And he goes to the guy and, he pours in oil and wine. Oil is always a symbol of the spirit. Wine is always a symbol of blood. Lifts him up onto his own beast, takes him to the inn. He's got 2 denarii. The only other thing we know about denarii in the Bible is that it's a day's wage. It gets you through one day. So he's sort of putting him in the safe place for 2 days, and then he's going to return on the 3rd day to raise him back up again. This beautiful stranger who comes from outside the system, who raises up the dead guy. And then I love in the story that Jesus basically says, who was a neighbor to the guy who fell among thieves? And the question that had sparked the whole conversation was, who is my neighbor? The teacher of the law is like, who is my neighbor? And Jesus is like, yeah, right. Who was the neighbor to the dead guy? So who are we meant to be in the story? You're meant to be the dead guy, right? Yeah. To whom extraordinary mercy has been shown.
Yes.
And here is this stomach-churning mercy and compassion and love that's been shown to you in all your sin and shame and unrighteousness. And then Jesus pours his blood out for you. He pours his spirit into you. He raises you up. And he'll complete the job, on this 3rd day resurrection kind of move. And then he says, go and do likewise. And he says, go and do, and that's the story, that really birthed this compassion revolution. It's the story that's birthed this Christian movement that has overtaken the world.
I love that. We were having dinner in London at a Korean spot you took us to. Such a great time. Me, John McCrae, yourself, my man Ray Rock, and we had this really interesting conversation about this triangle you described, and the tension that many of us theologically can wrestle with when it comes to soteriology, when it comes to hell, when it comes to all of these really real things that I think people are wrestling with. Can you kind of break that down to me again in this conversation?
I'm trying to think how it came up on the night, but we were talking about God's activity in salvation, and if God really wants everybody saved, how come there's a hell and that kind of thing. And one of the ways I think about this is, it seems to me like there are 3 truths that the Bible speaks of in this area that are really clear. There is probably a dozen verses plus that are connected to each one of these 3 truths, and I can't figure out how 3 of them are true at once, right? And I don't know anyone who's figured out how to make these three truths true all at once. And therefore, we often just speak to 2 of those truths and not all 3. The 3 truths are, God really wants everybody saved. He says it again and again and again and again.
Very, very clear.
Old Testament, New Testament, God so loved the world, and like the propitiation for the whole world and all that kind of stuff. So God really, really, really wants to save everybody. He says it. Let's just believe him, right? But also in the Bible, when God saves someone, he does it all. Like he actually saves people. The story before, the story after the Good Samaritan, when you get into Luke chapter 15, Jesus talks about the good shepherd who just goes into the far country. He lifts up this lost sheep, puts it on his shoulders, and walks the sheep all the way home. He doesn't say, "Come on, Flossie, let's get home." He does it all. So God really, really wants to save everybody. He keeps on saying it. When he saves people, he does all the work. And the third truth is there's such a place as hell, right? And I don't know how to make all those 3 things true, but the Bible consistently says them. And what tends to happen is that, okay, so you can take 2 of those truths. God really, really wants to save everybody, and hell is populated. So how is that true? Oh, okay. We must contribute to our salvation. And there are some people who contribute and they get saved. There's some people who don't contribute and they go to hell.
Right.
And, classically, that's kind of falling on the Armenian side of that great debate.
Yep.
Other people, they take the truth that hell is populated, and they take the truth that when God saves people, he does the entire job. So how come there are people left in hell? Well, he clearly doesn't want to save everybody, right? And so you deny the fact that he wants to save everybody, and that's many forms of Calvinism, right? Or you take the fact that God wants to save everybody, and he does the entire job, so no hell, right?
Universalism.
And so it seems to me that the sort of the Calvinist side of things, the Armenian side of things, the universal side of things, are basically attempts to square this circle. They're basically attempts to take two of these truths and not all three. And I'm just, I don't know, maybe I'm wishy-washy, you know, but
you're a fence sitter.
I will die on this fence.
I think you're right that all three are true. And again, it goes back to what I said earlier. It's like that paradoxical tension that we have to wrestle with. And I'm okay with living in that tension. You know? So I love how you broke that down. That was really helpful to me. Tell people about this 3-2-1 course that you have that is equipping people to kind of do some of the work that's in your wheelhouse.
So for the last 15 years, I've been kind of explaining the gospel in terms of 3, 2, and 1. And it's basically life according to Jesus. If you come and let Jesus describe God to you, the world to you, and yourself to you, he'll talk to you about the threeness of God, the two-ness of the world, the oneness of you. And so the threeness of God is that he is the Son, filled with the Spirit, bringing you to the Father. So Trinity. The two-ness of the world is that the world is split between the way it's meant to be, as is represented in Jesus, and the world as it is, that's represented by Adam in all its sin and curse and judgment. And so what did Christ do? Well, Christ, the second Adam, came and took our plight on himself. He took our death, rose up again, and he says to us, be one with me. And that's the one, right? We're born one with Adam, we're born again, and we're one with Jesus. And so 3, 2, and 1 are these ways I've been explaining the gospel for 15 years. And people can go to 321course.com.
Yeah, we have it pulled up here.
And discover life according to Jesus. There are 8 sessions that you can do. You can binge the whole thing in 2 hours, or you can take it one thing at a time. Churches can do it. So we've got 1,000 churches running this. And we're seeing hundreds of people come to Christ either through the online route, and we've got around about 20,000 people who've signed up to do it online. And it's free. And it's totally free. Yes. Thank you, Zach. The price is right, people. The price is right.
That's beautiful, man. Well, so 321course.com.
That's the one.
Yeah, Glenn, thank you so much for doing this, man. Hopefully we have you back. Maybe sometime I'll be in your neck of the woods and we'll do something over the pond.
I'll have you on Speak Live. That'd be great.
Hey, thank you so much for checking out the video. Please be sure to comment below and subscribe and all that good stuff. And check out this other video that YouTube seems to be recommending just for you. Let me know if they nailed it. All right? I'll see you over there. Peace.